At the end of Lesson 1, we did some geographic mapping to look at the resources available in our communities and possibly other communities. We talked about how the places we live might impact how COVID-19 affects us. For example, depending on where we live, we might have more or less access to healthcare, such as hospitals, places to get medicines, and COVID-19 testing and vaccines. In Lesson 2, we explore data to see how COVID-19 has impacted our state or community. We compare that data to racial data to see that COVID-19 has had a greater impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. This lesson was designed for students to explore local data, so spend some time looking at the data for your communities before you teach this lesson. We have provided the websites for state health departments in Lesson 2 appendix, but you may find other sources of local data that you would like to use instead. When students are able to explore data from their own communities, it is more meaningful to them. You might be wondering how to include local data or how to support your students in finding patterns in that data. Let's hear more about that.
Students and I really liked the racial dot map. In general, I think that students or kids in general are really interested in looking for patterns, sort of in an almost Where's Waldo kind of way. And so we took advantage of that superpower by playing with the racial dot maps for a while. We explored our small town in Iowa. I live in a rural part of Iowa. And so we used the racial dot map and I helped them see how to use the map by modeling for them on a large TV screen that we have in our classroom. We talked about what we noticed in terms of in the dots, and we practiced like, how do you read this? And then what we did was we moved to our location to a neighboring town, which has a meat packing plant and has a much different demographic than our town, which is predominantly white. I asked them what did they notice about the similarities and the differences between the two towns. It also allowed us to introduce the idea that history of a place has an influence on who lives there.
I teach in a predominantly white community. There's not a whole lot of diversity present. And so looking at that map, just starting off for my students, it meant nothing. It was a map that was all blue. For my students who were third graders, that connection wasn't there. They didn't know what to do with that information. And so the way I chose to handle it was to look at the community that I live in versus the one that I work in, which is a lot more diverse. And so first I showed them my community so they could see on the map the diversity that is there, the different colored dots, even the different colored dots in different neighborhoods being more the same, like, oh, here's a cluster of orange dots, here's a cluster of blue dots, and things like that. That kind of helped them. It's a community that they're all familiar with, and it helped them then that when we went to look at our community where our school is, they did see the difference. And they did make the connection of, oh wow, we really don't have a ton of diversity there. We use Notice, Wonder, Know charts a lot, and one of my favorite things the kiddo wrote was, I know that I am a blue dot. And even though that seems like a really silly statement, it still shows me that they were understanding what they were talking about. They were identifying with what was happening in the map data, which I think a lot of times it's easy for us to kind of not be able to put ourselves in that, and they really were putting themselves in it.
Students may be angry, frustrated, sad, or have a range of feelings about how COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. It is important to acknowledge and validate those feelings and give students space to share their feelings.
My suggestions would be to be open and honest with your students. They're very intuitive, so they know what's going on in the world. We just got to make sure that we give them the space and the opportunities to have conversations with each other and with others and with us. As educators, we want to be the experts, but we're not always the experts, and we got to tell our kids we're not the experts, and we want to learn and grow with them. So having the opportunity to maybe preview it ourselves so we can unpack our own feelings and thoughts about things, about the racial inequities in the world and about the disparities and the health care for people of color, taking that on ourselves to first think about it before we share with our students the lessons, but then being open and honest about what we learned and how we feel and how that makes us feel. My personal goal is to make sure that I include history of all cultures in my school day throughout the year. I don't want to just celebrate it one month out of the year, such as Black History Month in February and Hispanic Month in September. I don't want to do that. I want to focus on our differences, and I want to focus on how we're alike. And I want our kids to see that, or my kids to see that every day. But again, to go back, how to talk to your students about racial inequities and about COVID, be open and honest about your feelings and what you're going through and what maybe a family member's gone through, and just share that with them. But also understand that facts are facts. Inequities are all over the place, especially in this day and age.